Welcome, everybody, to the Institute on Religion and Democracy's annual Diane Knippers lecture. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute, and I am successor to Diane Knippers, who worked at the IRD across much of 3 decades, during half of which she was the president of the IRD. She sadly left us in 2005, but is very much remembered and beloved and has an enduring legacy, which included advocating for a strong social witness by America's churches, included advocating for religious freedom for all people. Our speaker, appropriately this evening, is someone whom Diane admired very much, Congressman Frank Wolf, who, like Diane, for decades was and is a strong advocate for human rights and religious freedom for all people. He himself served in Congress across 3 decades from Northern Virginia and was much respected, not just by his own party, but across the aisle for his commitment to principles and for human rights for all people. I can tell you that I personally met Frank Wolf in 1978 at the age of 13 when he first ran for Congress. Is that correct? He's 76. He first ran. Second time in 1978. I met him. My parents met him. My grandparents met him. My visiting great uncle from California met him, because you could not go anywhere in Northern Virginia without meeting Frank Wolf in 1978. And he did not win that year, but his perseverance paid off because he did win in 1980 and consecutively won re-election for many years after that. So we're delighted that in his retirement, he can be with us to deliver the Diane Knippers lecture, which is being broadcast live on IRD's social media and will be posted to YouTube afterwards. So we greet not only the people who are here physically, but all those who are watching online. And Congressman Frank Wolf, we're so grateful you can join us, and we've been looking forward to your message.
Well, thank you, Mark. I didn't. I don't remember meeting you, to be honest with you, but Mark is right though. I ran in '76 and lost. I ran in '78 and lost again, and didn't win until 1980. And I won more because of Ronald Reagan, perhaps, than anything else. But I did go everywhere, and I see the Christian Embassy people here. I was driven so much that the Christian Embassy helped save my family by letting me see a film called Where's Dad by Dr. Dobson. That's how driven I was and away from my family during that period of time. I want to thank you for being here. As Mark said, I followed Diane's the work that she had done and was very, very impressed. I know your board. Looked up Carl Henry, which I did not know, but I knew Carl well because he worked with Chuck Colson for a number of years, and I served with his son in Congress. Also, Kent Hill used to come by my office quite a bit. Walter Kansteiner, who I did not know was involved with you, but I saw that he was when he was Assistant Secretary of African Affairs. And of course, Mark and the great staff, and Jeff worked for me, and Faith McDonald and I have known each other for 1,000 years and have exchanged emails on Sudan and everything else. And so it's good to be here. I want to my talk tonight is not a political talk. It's a talk based on where I think we are, and some of you may not even agree with me. And it's not a partisan talk, because my best friend in Congress, who I spoke with a good bit today, is former Congressman Tony Hall. Tony and I were in a small Bible study for years and traveled the world together, and we were in a small covenant group for 32 years, and still are. And my wife Carolyn and his wife are in a small group, and these are my personal views. I'm not speaking for anybody or any group other than myself. And I want to say I thank my wife Carolyn for driving me down here too. So my wife Carolyn is with me here. My wife is 61 years. It was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, and it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, and it was the season of light. It was a season of darkness. It was a spring of hope, and it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In 1859, when Charles Dickens wrote those words in A Tale of Two Cities, it was said that God ruled and sin pervaded. This is true today as we look at the issues of religious freedom, both domestic, which I will cover, and international. There is not enough time to tell of all the good things that are taking place in the world. We see the church growing in China and Africa, and we see many, many good things in this country and around the world that are taking place. But we see a rising hostility to religious freedom internationally, as well as in Western nations, even, unfortunately, here in the United States. These are difficult times. Like I'm 83 years old. My wife and I, we have 5 children. We have 16 grandkids. I see things. These are things and times that I never thought that I would see. Personally, I believe that America is facing both economic and moral decline. Decline is a choice. Decline is a choice. It is not a destiny that says you will decline, but the choices that you make could very well, we hope not and pray not, could very well lead to decline. I believe that politics are downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from the church. On this subject, I recommend, and I brought a copy of the book to hold up so you can see it. I recommend that everyone here and everyone who watches this online read Erwin Lutzer's book, No Reason to Hide, Standing for Christ in a Collapsing Culture. It is so powerful, and it is so relevant to what is taking place today. And Chuck Colson was a mentor of mine for a number of years. I would call Chuck on usually Sunday evenings, and we would talk about some of the things that were coming up. Wrote a book that very few people have ever read called My Final Word, that was actually written and published 5 years after Chuck died from the memos that Chuck wrote. Everything, and I encourage you to get the book, everything that Chuck predicted is really now taking place. In our economy, which I believe is a moral issue of the national debt, from 1789 in my hometown of Philadelphia, when President Carter left office, to 1981. So from 1789, George Washington, to 1981 to Jimmy Carter, who I thought was a very good man, and is a good man, the total debt for all those years was under $1 trillion. It was $690 billion from 1789 to 1981. The net debt for our nation now is over $31 trillion and growing. Actually, $2.1 trillion just in 1 year last year. And by 2028, it will be $78 trillion. By 2028. This is unsustainable. It is unsustainable. When the Congress and when the Obama administration walked away from the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which I supported, it literally doomed us to a certain point. But if you have $78 trillion debt in 2028, you cannot sustain it. We are facing, I think, unfortunately, moral decline. We see the breakdown of the American family, which is under severe attack. We see the legalization of marijuana. We see gambling in all states. I remember I was the author of the National Commission on Gambling, and in those days, I thought it was bad, but it was basically in Vegas and in Atlantic City. Now, just about every state has gambling, and if you listen to the radio ads and TV ads, they're even betting on individual games. They're betting on touchdowns. They're betting on passes. They're betting on, do you get a base hit? They're betting on everything. And pornography, I've always been grateful to Attorney General Ed Meese, who is a fine, fine man, for having the Meese Commission on pornography, which I thank goodness that Jim Dobson was willing to serve on, and now we see pornography at the touch of a screen everywhere we look and everywhere we go and everywhere on just your cell phone, wherever you are. We see church growth dropping, and this summer, the issue of Your Faith and Freedom magazine, which I read, shows the dramatic decline of all mainline churches. I'm a Presbyterian. I go to Vienna Presbyterian Church, mainline Presbyterian. And our church is still biblically sound. But I see it collapsing all over, and the numbers that Mark had in this latest edition, the number of churches that have closed, the number of churches that only have 25 people in them, is actually just so heartbreaking to see that. Gen Z, we see so many, 33% and growing, who are nuns. But you see the picture. There's no need to kind of go on. There is a rising hostility to religious freedom here in the U.S. and in other Western nations. We saw what took place to the Member of Parliament in Finland. Someone said basically what's taking place is chasing Christians into the underground. I'm often reminded of Cardinal Francis George, former president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. In 2010, Cardinal George said, I expect to die in bed, my successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square. Is this alarmist? Is it unnecessarily dramatic? I pray so, but the evidence before us at least demands an examination of the prospect. We are seeing self-censorship of employees in American companies and law firms. Many lawyers in big firms in Washington and New York and other places are reluctant. They're not told they can't, but are reluctant to say that they believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, or are reluctant to be an advocate with regard to being pro-life. They can, but the one will say to me, I have 2 children in college, I have a mortgage, I have 12 years left to go, I just can't take that chance. And we see actual censorship in major companies. In some companies, you would never say that you believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, and you would never say that you oppose abortion because of your religious beliefs. And you're even, hard to believe, you're even seeing some of this in the American military. I'm grateful for groups like Alliance Defending Freedom and First Liberty and the Beckett Fund and others. I think everybody at the end of the year, when you're looking to see your charitable contributions, these groups ought to be on your list, because without them, I don't know where we would go or how we would do. They represent people who face religious persecution in workplaces and schools and other places. If you read Ken Starr's latest book, and God bless Ken Starr, he was one of the finest individuals I ever knew. A humble man, one of the brightest men, great legal mind. If you read his latest book and you talk to him, basically now if you bring a case, you win. You win 6-3, you might win 7-2. Breyer many times would be there, we don't know, but you win. But that's 5 years of going through a very difficult time with great expenses and really tough sacrifices. And so it can be very difficult, even if you know ultimately you're gonna win. As Victor David Hansen recently said, one incorrect word can destroy a long career. And I'm concerned too that if there's less affiliation, as you say here, less affiliation with church and religion in America, there will be less concern about religious freedom and issues. Why, as Christians, must we be interested in religious freedom? The Bible has much to say about persecution, oppression, and ultimately freedom. Ecclesiastes 4:1 says, Again I looked, I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. In Luke 4:18 and 19, Jesus, reading from Isaiah in the synagogue in Nazareth, said, The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Hebrews 13:3 says, remember those in prison as you were their fellow prisoners, and those who are mistreated as if you were suffering. And Isaiah 58:10 says, if you satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. This is what God tells us. This is the heart of God. It's not an editorial in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. It's not a resolution passed by Congress. It is what God, is what the Bible commands us to do. All over this world, people of faith are denied the fundamental and inalienable human right to confess and express their faith according to dictates of their conscience. There has never been a greater need for action. Right now, there are probably more persecution going on worldwide than any other time in modern history. The Pew Survey, which you're all, I know, aware of, say 80% of the world's population live in a religiously repressive nation, and 10 years before that, in 2009, it was 70%, so you can see the numbers that keep going up and up and up. There is growing persecution, yet, unfortunately, the cries of the persecuted are often met with deafening silence, and also met with deafening silence by the church. The faith communities in many countries feel abandoned and sometimes doomed. I remember many times people would say, Mr. Wolf, you're in the people in America care deeply about us. I have seen firsthand the results of religious persecution. I have traveled to lands forever changed by atrocities committed there. I've spoken with men and women who have experienced unimaginable suffering and loss. My first major trip to Romania in 1985, where I saw Christians were being persecuted by the Ceausescu administration, and very few people in the church were speaking out for them. I saw what the Sudanese government did to the Christians throughout Sudan, especially in the south, where I know faith has worked on in so many years. Again in Darfur. Ambassador Brownback and I were the first members of Congress to travel there. We came back and urged U.S. officials to act and call it what it was, to call it genocide. I saw in Bosnia, I visited a Serb-run detention camp facility for Bosnian Muslims. Congressman Chris Smith and I went to Vukovar, and weeks later it fell, and all the people that we met down in the basements of Vukovar were murdered. I saw it in Rwanda, which the U.S. and the West ignored, despite all the cables coming into the State Department and coming into Kofi Annan at the UN, and despite desperate pleas and help, where hundreds of thousands were murdered, and the world stood by and watched. I saw it in northern Iraq. I visited in a plain where the ISIS had committed genocide against Christians and Yazidis. Yazidi parents wept over their daughters brutally abducted by ISIS fighters. Today, at this very moment, there are 2,700 women and girls, Yazidis, that have not been reunited with their families, and the world is relatively silent on that issue. Christian leaders in the Middle East lament at the destruction of the holy sites and the purging of entire communities from the ancient lands they had inhabited since antiquity. More biblical activity took place in Iraq than any other land other than Israel. Abraham was from Iraq. Nasiriyah. I've been to Nasiriyah. I've seen it. We went to Abraham, the site of Abraham's house. They said his village. The book of Daniel took place in Babylon, today in Iraq. Nahum's tomb is just north, just outside Erbil, and we saw that ISIS blew up Jonah's tomb and destroyed the tomb a number of years ago. I saw it in Egypt with the persecution of Coptic Christians and other minorities. Today, Mary and Joseph would not be advised to take baby Jesus to Egypt. Egyptian textbooks still have anti-Semitic and anti-Christian content, and we still see persecution of Coptic Christians and other minorities. Yet our country continues to give Egypt billions. Look it up how much has been in foreign aid for military and foreign aid for non-military. The billion number is astronomical. And yet we can't get Egypt to remove the anti-Semitic and anti-Christian content from the textbook even today. There was a report done 3 weeks ago where Yusuf and other people looked to see, and the anti-Semitic language and the anti-Christian language is still there after giving them billions and billions of dollars. I saw it in Pakistan where Christians were jailed for blasphemy. My Christian friend Shahbaz Bhatti, and if you ever go on YouTube, look at Shahbaz Bhatti's testimony to Christ. The minister of minority affairs was gunned down by leaving his mother's house. The Christian woman Asia Bibi. Asia Bibi was in prison for almost 8 years. And how much money do we give Pakistan? And how much did the church in the West say about Asia Bibi? And Ahmadi Muslims suffer very, very severe persecution in Pakistan. I saw it in Nigeria. Boko Haram is committing genocide against Christians, and there is genocidal activity by Fulani militants. It's the third most dangerous nation in the world. The third, according to the Global Terrorism Index, the third most dangerous nation in the world after Afghanistan and Iraq. And yet many thousands have been killed. There are constant stories of Catholic and Protestant clergy being killed. There's been going on for years, but we see little action on the part of Western government. Do you remember 8 years ago, the Chibok girls, bring back our girls, hashtag bring back our girls? When's the last time you've seen hashtag bring back our girls? And yet roughly 40%, when I was there, I met with some parents, 40% have not returned. And you all know or should know the story of Leah Sharibu, the young Christian girl, age 14, would not deny Christ, and is still there somewhere in the Sambisa forest, somewhere, and almost nobody in the church says very much about it in the West. I saw it in China. In my visit to Tibet, where Buddhist monks and nuns have set themselves on fire to protest cultural genocide by China. At every Buddhist monastery in Tibet, in Lhasa, outside Lhasa, there is a Chinese public security police there. They monitor. It would be like in your own church. If you went to Truro Episcopal Church, there would be a public security police there. If you went to the Vienna Presbyterian Church, there would be the public security police there. In China, the government detains and harasses and imprisons Catholic bishops. 5 were missing. Chris Smith took Holy Communion for Bishop Su, and Bishop Su has never been seen again. And Protestant house church leaders and the good work that Bob Fu has done trying to help. And Cardinal Zen, 90-year-old cardinal in Hong Kong, who I adopted as a prisoner of conscience, has been charged by the government. And if Cardinal Zen were sentenced to prison, a prison sentence for a 90-year-old man, and very few people, I've been shocked. Very few people have spoken out on behalf of Cardinal Zen. The Falun Gong face severe persecution, and there are continued reports of organ harvesting from the Falun Gong and from Uyghur Muslims as well. Most staggering is the genocidal campaign being waged against the Uyghur Muslim population. More than 1 million Uyghurs have been placed in detention camps. Former detainees report torture, rape, sterilization, and organ harvesting. There have been reports of crematoriums next to the camps. And American institutions are working with Chinese government training doctors. I watched the thing with the community, I won't mention names because I don't want to get them involved, where they said there was a young Christian who was in the camp and said in every one of the camps there are Hikvision cameras all over the camps. And some American institutions that we all know, are training the doctors. And 60 to 75,000, mainly Uyghurs, some Falun Gong, have been killed to take their organs. And I hear almost nothing from anyone in the church. The Washington Post ran an article headlined, Chinese Surveillance Builds Influence in Washington with help from former members of Congress. The Chinese tech company Hikvision is directly enabling the Chinese government in their campaign against the Uyghurs. At the same time, it's aggressively lobbying with the aid of former members of Congress to prevent or remove U.S. measures limiting the company's ability to do business with American companies and investors. All these lobby firms. Read the book by Peter Schweitzer. Have you read the book called Red Handed? Read the book. All these lobby firms. They represent China and Chinese companies while we are in a Cold War with China. China may very well invade Taiwan or blockade Taiwan. This lobbying activity must be stopped. There's been no comment by anybody in the church, and during the Reagan years, no law firm in this city would have ever represented the Soviet Union. And now just look at the list and go on, look at the fair registration. But Hikvision, in the camps, filming, doing all this stuff, read National Review, read about the Tiger Chairs. A Republican member of Congress, former, and a Democratic former member. And I almost hear nothing at all from anybody in this town and nothing from anybody in the church. Anti-Semitism. We are seeing growing anti-Semitism in many places around the world and even here in the United States. I believe that the BDS movement is a soft form of anti-Semitism. There's rising and vocal anti-Semitism on many college campuses today. Christians should be speaking out about this. Over much of history, Jews have suffered betrayal, scorn, and persecution. No survey was needed to determine whether countries were free. Simple visits to synagogues did the job. As history has shown, if the Jews of a country were free to practice their faith, one could be reasonably confident that tolerance and freedom were possible for others. I just saw, go online, I'm not going to mention the college, go online and see what I saw 3 days ago that my daughter sent me about a college, you know the college, out in California with regard to Jewish students. And I have not seen one person speak out against it in the Christian church. We as followers of Christ are obligated to do something about all this persecution in the world, including the persecution of Christians. My friend, Princeton professor Robbie George, has speculated that perhaps Americans and other Western Christians are afraid of being accused of self-pleading if they demand justice on behalf of their co-religionists. They're concerned with how the cultural elite and so-called beautiful people, many of whom are antagonistic toward Christianity, and for that matter, most of the commonly held social teachings of the world's major religions, would perceive them. Perhaps of greater consequences, they have on some level bought into what is a key premise of liberal secularism, namely that religion in general, and Christianity in particular, is inherently oppressive. The narrative is that Christians are always the oppressor, never the oppressed, always the persecutor, never the persecuted. There are many ways in which that narrative is untrue. Any student of history knows that it was Christians whose pursuit of justice animated the movement against slavery in the 18th century and for civil rights in the 20th century. And it has been men and women of faith confronted with the plight of the prisoner and burdened by the struggles of the poor who still today seek the dignity of every man, woman, and child. Christians have started respected universities and hospitals around the world. Christians run major feeding programs for the poor. Mother Teresa and Chuck Colson did what they did because of their faith. One of the most powerful writings in modern times is the Reverend Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. In it he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." We know through painful experience, he said, that freedom is never voluntarily given up by the oppressor. It must be demanded. It must be demanded by the oppressed. King admonished the church. He said, "I must honestly reiterate that I've been disappointed with the church. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protests in Montgomery, Alabama, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt the white ministers and priests and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents. All too many have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent." King concludes, "In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church. So often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound." I believe these powerful words of Reverend King can apply to the issue of religious freedom, both domestic and international. I personally, speaking for myself, am disappointed in the church in the West. I'm concerned about the silence of the church. Waiting for the right time to act is really not an option. As we look at the persecution of all faiths around the world, are we, who consider ourselves men and women of faith in 2022, more cautious than courageous? Are we willing? Are we willing? And I will say that I am. If there's an opportunity, just call me. Are we willing to risk imprisonment for what we believe? In the Bible, we see it as common for those who follow God to end up in jail. Joseph resisted the advances of another man's wife, and he was jailed. Daniel and his friends refused to stop worshiping their God, and they were jailed. John the Baptist publicly decried the sin of the leaders in his land, was jailed and ultimately beheaded. The Apostle Paul wrote many of his letters from a Roman jail cell. And I've always admired the civil rights activists in the 60s who were willing to go to jail for what they believed. They knew when they went to the restaurants and knew when they did the sit-ins, they knew they were going to be arrested. But they were still willing to do it. It may be that we, if you believe what's taking place, are entered a time for Christians to participate in civil disobedience. Who would have thought that 25 FBI agents would be sent to the home of a pro-life leader in Pennsylvania to arrest him in front of his wife and children? I was chairman of the committee that funded the FBI for 10 years. I have admired the FBI. The rank and file FBI agents are doing an amazing job. But what's taking place at the top? 25 agents go and break down and arrest in front of a woman and her children, somebody like that. And I've seen almost no one in the church say anything at all about it. These are profound questions of conscience which every man and woman must answer for themselves. I believe that we in the West will find ourselves better able to count the costs the more intimately acquainted we are with our persecuted brothers and sisters abroad. When I would tell my wife, when I would go to Romania and I would go to Sudan and I would go to the Nigeria and when I would go to, I got more out of it than they got out of me going there. Usually as you're saying goodbye, you expect them to give you a list of, you say, what can I do? Pray. Pray. If we know their stories, if we weep at their wounds, if we intercede on their behalf through prayer and advocacy, I'm confident we will find ourselves shaped by the courage of these men and women as they become more than faceless and nameless victims in distant places and hard-to-pronounce prison cells. And if we're clear-eyed about the times in which we live, I believe these encounters will make our own faith more robust and strengthen us for the days that I think are coming. It is said that when World War I German hero Martin Niemöller was imprisoned by the Nazis, a fellow pastor came to him, and the pastor asked how a man of Niemöller's statue could be placed in a place like this. And Niemöller replied, quote, "The question isn't how I could be here, but why aren't you here too?" What remains to be seen in our day is whether men and women of faith and others of goodwill will accept the challenge regardless of where it leads us. When asked why he continually spoke out against injustice, Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said, if I remain silent, I may help my own soul. But because I do not help others, I poison my own soul. Silence never, ever helps the victim. It only helps the victimizer. It's a powerful statement. Silence never helps the victim. It only helps the victimizer. In fact, silence actually encourages the wrongdoers to continue their acts of silence. The fact that no religious leader has spoken out about the man's house being raided up in Philadelphia, the pro-life person in front, they'll be incented to maybe do it again and again and again. No one said anything, and particularly no one in the church said anything. In the 18th century, British parliamentarian William Wilberforce said this to his fellow countrymen: about the evils of the slave trade. He said, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again, you do not know. And Reverend Martin Luther King said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Are we not the friends of the persecuted? And a friend, the German Lutheran pastor, an anti-Nazi dissident Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. So will we pray? And will we speak? And will we act? So when we leave here today, and none of us can ever say with the internet and all the news that just floods over us, we can never say we do not know. So let us commit to God that we will pray, and we will speak, and we will act regardless of the cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Wolf, and thank you for being a very attentive audience. We have time for several questions. I did want to recognize that the wonderful husband of the late Diane Knippers, Ed Knippers, is here with us, so we're grateful for your presence, Ed. And then I think we have more German visitors in our office than we've ever had before in 40 years. So wonderfully, we have a delegation of 6 people, mostly from Bavaria, with the Hans Seidel Foundation, which is a think tank, the Bavarian Christian Social Union. So I hope there are some intelligent German questions for Congressman Wolf here in the next few minutes. Any questions or comments? Anyone? Everyone's overcome with emotion? Yes, go ahead.
What can the average American Christian do?
Well, you can pray. Obviously, I believe the power of prayer is tremendous. You can speak that, and then you can act. You could literally lead a delegation and picket the Chinese embassy. You could seek to find some trial lawyers that are willing to take Hikvision on and sue Hikvision. I believe they're in violation of the law. The very fact that you can put cameras in and you can find out who are the American universities, and I won't mention the names, who are actually training Chinese doctors so they can go back and take the organs out and take the heart out and take the kidney out. There's a lot that we can do. Now, in fairness, there are some people who are afraid. This audience probably isn't in that category because most of you are working for groups that probably that would all be okay. But if you're with big firm XYZ and you're representing this group and that group and that group, you just don't want to take it on. But there's a lot that we can do. Yes, yes, ma'am.
Yes.
I really appreciate for your great lecture. Yeah, and I'm going to ask you something. I really agree with you that you mentioned about the persecution is growing and growing. And I think that the biggest threat to Christianity would be, also persecution would be right, but I think the biggest one would be like collapsing ourselves. We are losing our values of Christianity, and I think it is very related to our political agendas, like you mentioned about pro-life and pro-choice. And I want to ask you that what would be some kind of agendas that American Christians should protect and keep? Because to be honest, I'm from South Korea, and I work for South Korean churches and for like conservative parties, and the churches were gathered and unified after the COVID situation because the government really persecuted the Korean churches. They ordered us to just shut down the church and be in our home and do not go to the service. And then we realized that this persecution would be so great that we cannot do anything. So after that, we unified with the agendas, that is LGBTQ and education for the like youngers, and we are starting to talk about like pro-life the abortion. And I was kind of shocked because after I arrived in America, after I arrived here, I saw some Christians have different opinion of these kind of agendas. I am kind of like afraid of speaking kind of these issues because I know these are so sensitive in here. So I want to ask you about what kind of agendas would be like the Christians in U.S. should keep and serve and fight for. That was my question. Thank you.
Well, I think one, everyone should read Ken Starr's book. If you haven't read it, you ought to buy it and you ought to read it. First thing you can do is, if you see discrimination and you are subject to it, you can sue. Now, it takes a long while. The First Liberty case took the coach out in Washington State. It took 5 years to win that case. But you almost always win when you sue. Almost. There can be exceptions, but we have a relatively favorable court, and in fairness, Justice Breyer, as I said, who was a Democratic member, would support it. So if you read Ken's book, you almost always win. So you can be willing to sue. Also, you can speak out. You can be. I think you can try to push this. Tony Hall and I were going around, and I'm not going to mention any colleges. We were going around before COVID and going on some of the Christian colleges and speaking. I was at one very major Christian college, a good college, and a young man gave us a tour around the campus. And I said, something about the elections, and he said he had been out canvassing for, I shouldn't mention the name, for another person, because that person was for social justice. But I said the real person was Chuck Colson. It was not that person. I was shocked that many people on the Christian college campuses. On one Christian college, I asked and said something about Chuck Colson, and they didn't know who Chuck Colson was. The one student said that his mother had told him that Chuck Colson had been arrested for breaking into a hotel. So I think one of the things you can begin, particularly for the Christian colleges, is going on to the Christian colleges. Secondly, there are a lot of very good things taking place in a lot of non-Christian colleges. There are a lot of Christian groups. But learning what your rights are and speaking out. And lastly, I don't want to say anything political, but also being politically involved to find the candidate, whether it's in the Republican Party or the Democrat Party, that agrees with you. Lastly, if at the end of the year, and you're from South Korea, I don't know how you do it, if at the end of the year you're looking to make a political a contribution, a charitable contribution, Alliance Defending Freedom ought to be on your list. And if they're not on your list, then First Liberty down in Dallas ought to be on your list. And if they're not on your list, the Beckett Fund ought to be on your list, or 3 or 4 of the other ones. But to help those that are bringing suits that are not fearful. So there's so much that can be done. Lastly, I mean, China is what they're doing to Cardinal Zen, Catholic cardinal, 90 years old, Protestant pastors in jail. China is refusing to send. There have been 600 North Koreans that have tried to leave North Korea that are in China. China is thinking about repatriating them, sending them back to North Korea, which will literally be a death sentence. The fact that the South Korean government, I don't want to get involved in politics, the previous administration sent back 2 Chinese fishermen that got out of North Korea and came and sent back. I mean, speak out, demonstrate, stand out in front of the American embassy, do that, stand out in front of the Chinese embassy, do. So there's so much that you can do. Some are afraid, some don't know. But the fact that and maybe we have failed, and maybe we have not transferred this knowledge on to our children and our grandchildren. But if you're in a Christian college, this ought to be in your veins and in your blood and wanting to do that. And lastly, I think one of the best things, I got elected in 1981 Big issue was HOV on 66. Big issue was a thing called Metro, METRO. Big issue was adding another lane. Big issue was nighttime noise standards and in Arlington because the airplanes were coming in. I had never been out of the country before I went to Canada once for one day. I'd never been out. In 1984, Tony Hall called me on the phone and said, "Wolf, I just got back from Ethiopia. You got to go." I was naive. I had never been out of the country. I called the ranking Republican on the committee, Sil Conti, he said, go. I went, and it broke my heart. What I saw there, and then in 85, Chris Smith, and I'll tell you something, Chris Smith is the finest member of Congress on these issues that I've ever served with. Chris Smith and Tony Hall and I went to Romania in 1985 under the Ceausescu administration. We spent a week. And those two things just broke my heart. So I think if you really want to sense this, go and work with the Samaritan's Purse or work with Catholic Relief or work with one of those and go and visit. There's nothing like being in a refugee camp at 6:30 and 7 in the morning when everyone is beginning to wake up and kind of go around. But be there with them because the best thing you can do is to show. But there are so many things that you can do, particularly at your young age. Your future is wide open. But one thing you can't do, you just can't be silent. Because if you are silent, you're aiding those who are really doing the bad thing.
Time for possibly one more question. Christian Forstner, would you speak to the microphone?
Well, thank you, Congressman. Christian Forstner with the Hans Seidel Foundation, foundation named after Prime Minister of Bavaria in the 50s. So Western societies change. People become less religious. So where do you see and what kind of role for Christian religion do you see in Western societies without inflicting the rights of religious minorities? And in light of this, so in Germany we have the tradition of carrying, so political parties carry the name of Christianity, Christian Democratic Union, Christian Social Union. But now with society less and less religious, would you recommend they give up the name Christian in the party name and become something like a more conservative, secular political party?
I don't feel comfortable commenting on German political policy. I actually, both my grandmother were from Germany and my grandfather were from Germany. My grandfather was German and his family lived in the Ukraine up until 1914, and he came to America. I don't have a recommendation for Germany. I think in some respects, when I read Mark's newsletter and see what's taking place in the Methodist Church, and see what has taken place in the Episcopal Church, and see what's taking place in my own church, I think a lot of it comes back to really passing on. Secondly, I think it's Jesus. What does Jesus say on these issues? Lastly, there are many. I was co-chairman of the Ahmadi Muslim Caucus. I'm not an Ahmadi Muslim. I went to places. I came back and I gave a speech on the floor against the Croatians who were Catholic and Christian for the Muslims in Bosnia, because what was taking place, and having been in that camp that I saw, the Serbs were running, Muslims were being running around like this. The Uyghurs are all Muslim. They care deeply about these issues. You could align with them. The Tibetans. I mean, frankly, I don't know many Tibetans that I've met that have ever been to Tibet. What's taking place in Lhasa? Lhasa is cultural genocide. So you can unite with the Tibetans, you can unite with the Uyghurs, you can unite with the Falun Gong, you can kind of put together. I believe that we should have religious feasts for all people. And also I think, and I kind of end this, when I was in Germany one time with Dan Coates, who was our ambassador, Dan took me to Grunewald station, and he took me up on the rank, and I saw where cars were taken, and then we went to Dachau, and then we went to, maybe you've been there, we went to Bonhoeffer's house in Berlin. I think in the Christian church in the United States and all over, we should have a Bonhoeffer movement. I believe that every Christian pastor should speak out against anti-Semitism. So I think we can lead by doing this and unite with all the other people. But whether you change the name of, I don't know. But I think I'll boil back. I think it's what we do for ourselves, because at the end of the day, we're going to stand before the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, have to give an accountability of what we do. So I think the important thing is each and every person ought to pray. I believe in the power of prayer. Ought to speak, and then, quite frankly, they ought to act. In closing, there's a new book out by Tom Ricks, R-I-C-K, about those who integrated the South. It's coming out, I think, this week, how they trained, what they did in order to integrate. I think we really may have to have a form of civil disobedience to be willing to put ourselves out and speak out, because the very thing, back to the fact, you probably didn't follow it, we had a pro-life leader in Philadelphia who the case was dismissed at the local level. 15 to 20 to 25 FBI agents came by and raided his house in front of his wife, in front of his children. Well, the church really has to speak out. There are so many things to do that I think we as individuals can do them. In closing, thank you for coming. I appreciate the good work that IRD does, and I'm not giving up on this country. I think there are a lot of good people. I think that we can do a lot, but I think we really need to have the church to wake up first. Thank you very much.